Before the turn of the 20th century, progressives, or reformers looking to get rid of corruption in society, revealed this darker side of big companies. They differed, however, on how to best control these big businesses. President Theodore Roosevelt, who took on the U.S. presidency after the assassination of William McKinley, was in favor of these large companies and disliked the muckrakers, progressive-minded journalists who also believed the government was corrupt. Upton Sinclair is known as one of these muckrakers, exposing a dark and often gruesome side of the meat industries. In the early 1900s, the journalist Upton Sinclair published his novel The Jungle. The book details the unsanitary practices and immigrant labor issues that were prominent in the meatpacking industries at the time. It caused a large impact to the rest of the world and eventually led to new federal food laws and regulations against the issues. However, it was the appalling labor conditions in the plants that would be largely ignored, and instead Sinclair would spark an outrage among consumers who were furious to find that they had been cheated through falsely labeled meat. Now, it's not to say that the unsanitary meat was not a real issue at the time. The opposite is true. The meat would often be stored with a layer of borax or some other substance that was considered a common preservative back then, such as salicylic acid or formaldehyde, the latter of which is known today as a potential cause of cancer. Rat meat was also commonly stored in the food packages. The Jungle explicitly states, "This is no fairy story, no joke. The meat will be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling will not trouble to lift out a rat even when he saw one." After The Jungle was published, President Theodore Roosevelt ordered an immediate investigation of the meat industry. At the time, Chicago was number one in terms of the meat industry. The workers in the meat plants had to suffer through their own problems. Typically, they would work up to 60 or 70 hours a week on a floor covered in blood, bile, and filth, in rooms with no temperature control or ventilation. Machines could harm or maim the workers, but yet there was no medical support in the meat plants. Plants regularly employed children and immigrants eager to make money for their family, but they would earn little payment. An excerpt from The Jungle reads, "The big packers did not turn their hands, workers, off and close down like the canning factories, but they began to run for shorter and shorter hours. They had always required the men to be on the killing beds and ready for work at 7 o'clock, and so they would have to loaf around in a place where the thermometer might be 20 degrees below zero. Before the day was over, they would become quite chilled through and exhausted, and, when the cattle finally came, so near frozen that to move was an agony. All this was bad, and it was not the worst, for after all the hard work a man did, he was paid for only a part of it." So on each side of either issue, both are appalling and gruesome, but when Upton Sinclair published his book, his readers were mainly concerned with food safety. This was certainly not the reaction Sinclair had been hoping for. He famously says, "I aimed for the public's heart and by accident I hit its stomach," referring to his hope to spark disapproval and anger towards the labor conditions in the plants, but instead, his book got people protesting against the numerous unhygienic practices that were also featured in his book. Sinclair intended to spark an outrage for the inhumane working conditions, but all he got was a revolution among consumers instead, states an article, referring to the fact that the most dramatic reaction to Sinclair's book was from angry consumers worried about having eaten tainted meat. Mr. Sinclair was most certainly dismayed that the public's visceral reaction was not directed towards the reason he had wrote the book for in the first place, which was to exploit the cruel working conditions in the meat plants. Still, he leapt to action to make sure that the meat was taken into account by the government to instate food laws and regulations, such as the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which was signed by President Theodore Roosevelt, who had also shown concern, especially after the meat conditions Upton Sinclair had described were proved to be fairly accurate. Even though these descriptions of the meat filled only a small fraction of the book, it whipped the media into an outrage frenzy, and it seemed the labor conditions were to be left forgotten. The horror suffered by the workers paled against people's fears that they might be eating tainted meat, an online website comments. And it's true, the public's attention was hardly turned toward the suffering of the workers, due to their fear that their own health was on the line, which made them quite oblivious to what the immigrants and children in the factories had to deal with on a daily basis. In an interview with Upton Sinclair, one of the questions asked was, "How do you feel about the response your novel received?" To which Sinclair responded, "I am not happy with the results. The audience didn't really focus on what I wanted them to. Instead, they focused on food safety. I wanted them to realize that these workers were being exploited, but they misunderstood." In conclusion, when Upton Sinclair published his novel The Jungle, the message he had hoped to get across was misunderstood. His readers, instead of remonstrating against the labor conditions in the plants, were more concerned with the tainted meat. They were outraged to find that they had spent what little money they had on food that contained what was once rats and were in other ways unhygienically stored and packaged, but there was little protest against the labor conditions, which were equally horrific, employing children, working their employees until they could barely stand through the long hours with still low pay. This just goes to show that before furious consumers decided to pay attention to what was happening to other people inside the factories, they were more inclined to prioritize the food safety issues first out of concern for their own health. Although the laborers did attempt to strike back, it was not until the Great Depression of the 1930s that people's view of the unions began to change in sympathy, whereas the Meat Inspection Act and other food laws were instituted in the same year that The Jungle was published.